Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. In dreams, one of the girls saw a future. An incredibly beautiful girl she didn't even know. She saw everything from her lover to the future that awaited her. She had seen this girl's whole life in nothing but dreams. One day, in the imperial palace of the Ront World Empire, a girl named Giselle was doing her duties as usual. Another maid suddenly came up to her and addressed her several times at once, for Giselle was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not even immediately hear. It was a maid who also worked in the house, and she said that Madame Britta wanted to see her. Giselle, hearing this, was very surprised and wondered what she suddenly needed it for. But the girl replied that she didn't know anything, so she'd better go and check it out herself. Giselle didn't hesitate to go straight there. It was actually quite hard for her to work in that place. After all, she was a simple maid in the imperial palace. She had many duties to perform. And so, while Giselle was on her way to Madame Bright's room, she looked out the window and realized that her dreams will never change the life she has. As she passed the maids, she heard a glimpse of their conversation. One of them asked her friend if she had heard that His Majesty had thrown out another maid. When the maid heard this, you wondered in surprise, "Is this really the 8th time?" Her friend replied that this surprised her, and also asked if she knew by any chance who would be appointed after her. Giselle was not happy about anything at all. At times like this, she remembered the last words of her mother, who had ordered her not to leave the palace under any circumstances. She said that if she suddenly did, she wouldn't be able to stay alive outside of it. And the girl realized from a very young age that if she left this place, she would simply die. That's why she tolerated and forgave this place a lot. She had no choice. Well, when the girl still came to the head maid, she told her that starting the next day, the girl would serve the Crown Prince. Giselle, on hearing this information, was so surprised that she even required the maid to repeat what she had said. And when Madame Britta repeated this information, the girl replied that she knew perfectly well what would happen if she left the estate, didn't she? Giselle said in a trembling voice that there was no way she could leave the imperial palace. If she left, she would have nowhere else to go. She stepped closer to the maid and said that she knew full well that her mother was coming to find her and take her with her. But Madame Britta said that when they took her in, she had absolutely nowhere to go, and they raised her to adulthood. So the maid thinks she's done a lot more than she could. Giselle wanted to object, but she didn't, because the head maid said that she had no choice. All the maids had chosen by voting for her to be next. With no friends or family, they see that she would be best ignored simply and sent far away. Madame Britta came close to her, and taking her by the shoulders, told her that she was absolutely sure she would be all right. Smiling, she told Giselle that she had raised her to be a good person after all. So she wouldn't go to waste, that's for sure. And now that some time has passed, the moment has finally come when the girl must leave the imperial palace and move to Sunny. As soon as she got there, she was immediately greeted by a Sunny palace maid named Marianne. She turned to the girl and told her to make sure she always had the right posture, and wondered if she had forgotten what this Sunny palace was to her in the first place. Giselle didn't like it all at all, and Marianne said that this was where His Majesty and His Highness resided. The little son of the Empire of Rondner was the estate of Klonitzsche. There was a rather interesting man with a personality disorder living there. He's lazy, unreliable. This man was even sometimes called the ruler of blood. He was the most beautiful trash who lived his life contentedly. Almost all the maids he had were kicked out of the imperial palace and served him for about 2 weeks. Giselle turned to Madame Marianne and inquired as to why he had been kicked out by the previous maid in the commotion. The woman replied that he had asked the maid a question. When the girl heard about it, you were very surprised and wondered what the question was. Marianne then replied that he usually asks about women's preferences, such as what she thinks are the best flowers, and what fragrance and jewelry I would be charming in. And every girl who gives the wrong answer to that question is simply banished. Giselle was soon led to her room, and Madame advised her to take care of herself, for from that moment, her life began to depend on her every action and word. The girl was very surprised, but soon she entered the room of the gentleman who was sitting with his desk. As soon as she saw him, she was very surprised and realized that she would be servicing him. At the table sat the Crown Prince of the Empire, and his name was Levan. He looked handsome and stately. As soon as she entered his room, she immediately smelled some strong odor, and it wasn't very pleasant. But nevertheless, She came close to him and bowing, said that she would begin her duties the very next day and would assist His Highness in bathing. After she said this phrase, there was complete silence all around. Only the sounds of the clock that hung on the wall could be heard. Lebanon then turned to the new maid and asked that she look at him. When Giselle looked up, he immediately inquired where she was from. The girl was beginning to worry, but she said that she had been born and raised in this palace, and before she arrived in the solar part, she worked in the lunar part of the palace. When the man heard this information, he was immediately interested and asked if she was really born in this place. The man at this point thought about the fact that her hair color was completely atypical of their empire and realized that she was lying to his face. He decided that this time he would be completely shameless and check her out right away. Then he snapped his fingers and called several maids to him. As soon as the maids entered the room, they carried several bouquets of flowers in their hands. Lebanon turned to the new maid and asked that she answer which bouquet she thought was the most beautiful. But then, suddenly, Marianne turned to His Highness and bowed, saying that this child had only been delivered to Sun Palace this morning, and she hadn't even unpacked yet. Giselle in turn immediately realized that he had decided to check her out right away, apparently in order not to waste time. Lewan said, "That's a very good thing. That way she wouldn't have to go through the trouble of unpacking if she answered wrong now." They were silent for some time. Then the girl asked him if she could ask him what the flowers were for. Giselle apologized to him for being honest with him, but smugly told him that in that case, none of those bouquets were appropriate. The man was a little surprised, but didn't show it on his face, only wondering why she thought that. In fact, the reason was quite simple. One woman's future the girl had seen in dreams, and he, the Crown Prince, was also present there. And there are absolutely no roses or lilies in her flavor. It's simple and glamorous. Giselle said that lilies smell too bright and can stay for quite a while, and that can bring discomfort and trouble. So she wondered what he thought about freesias for gifts. Lebanon then said that she must be talking about her own preferences, and wondered if she thought the girl might have different tastes. But Giselle replied that she had worked all her life in the moon chamber and served numerous nobles, and as a result, she knows well the tastes of noble ladies of the same age as her, so she is quite sure that the girl might like the flowers she has chosen. The Crown Prince smiled and said he could see that, and wondered if these roses and lilies he had chosen were really a bad choice. Giselle immediately realized that she had said a little too much, so turning to His Highness she replied that that was not what she meant. But the man picked up some papers, and throwing them in her face, wondered how she even dared to be so sure and criticize the Crown Prince's choice so much. The man also said he assumed she was willing to be held accountable for her words. They were silent for a while, and then he said that in that case he would send her the for sales after all, and they would see what would come of it. Shortly afterward, when they came out, Marianne immediately turned to the girl and inquired why she had taken such a great risk. She also added that she had been at the palace much longer than everyone else, and had never even heard of these frasalias. Giselle was well aware that if she told them that she had seen the future in her dreams, no one would believe her. She certainly couldn't tell them about it, and so she said that she had lied to His Highness. When Marianne heard this, she wondered in surprise if she dared to lie to His Highness on her first day. The girl immediately replied that she would be much more careful next time, and it wouldn't happen again. But more importantly, the maid turned to her and said that she might not need it, since His Highness might have already decided to kick her out. As night fell, Lebanon was sitting in his study, and the butler suddenly came in to tell him that the messenger had already returned. The man, hearing this, was immediately interested and asked what it was about that bouquet. The butler, bowing, said that Lady Regina was extremely pleased and thanked him for the lovely bouquet. Levan looked at him in surprise and asked, "Did this girl really handed it to him like that?" In fact, the Duke's daughter, who never reacted to even the most expensive jewelry, ended up sending a thank you for a bouquet of flowers that the most ordinary people liked. Then the gentleman inquired what was the name of the maid who had advised him of these flowers. His assistant, the Viscount Varna, said her name was Giselle. The name was given to her by her mother, whose whereabouts are still unknown at this time. It's also a consonance with a wildflower. Lebanon, upon hearing this, was very surprised and did not understand how a mother could give her daughter a name after some plant. Then he asked the assistant to look up as many details as possible about the girl herself and her mother. The assistant immediately said that everything would be done, and the man also asked that they notify the head maid as well. In the evening, Marianne went straight to and said that she had gotten a job as His Highness's bath assistant. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and did not understand what was even happening, and also how such a thing was possible. She also explained that the head maid would explain the detailed schedule to her later. Giselle was still very surprised and turned to Marianne and asked, "Does this mean she won't be kicked out of the palace?" The woman replied that His Highness had told her to just deliver the message and nothing more. She also said one phrase that the man asked her to pass on, which was that the girl should unpack her things, and he called her petals. In fact, almost all of the time, elementary Prince Levan starts his day very early in the morning. He goes out and practices very hard all the time to perfect his ball skills. At this very time, Giselle comes to his room and rearranges the bed, whereupon she draws a bath for his return. When she finishes cleaning out the cigar ashtray, she does the most important part of her business, which is to burn incense around the room to keep it from stinking. And when His Highness is absent, just before he goes to bed, she burns a whole stick each in his bedroom to make everything there very fragrant. Shortly after the man has gone to work out and taken a shower, he returns to his room and begins to light a cigar. At the most important, Giselle must remember that if she wants to stay in this place as long as possible, she must stay as far away from the Crown Prince as possible at all. According to the rumors in Sun Palace, all the maids who were kicked out showed great interest in the Crown Prince, and that was the reason why they didn't stay there for long. Shortly afterward, the pontiff arrived at Levan's house, and his aide immediately told him about it. The man then replied that he could run it. At the same moment, a man entered the room, and bowing, he said hello to His Highness. The man, still sitting in his seat, greeted the pontiff, and the latter inquired as to His Highness's health. The man replied that he had heard that he enjoys cigars to relieve his symptoms, and also burns special incense every day, and tries not to show it because of his temper. However, things are definitely not good for him. His father said that just like the others, Lebanon was blessed by the temple when he became an adult this year. The pontiff replied that this was all perfectly true, and the man said that, as a result, the power which His Highness had manifested was indeed marvelous. However, he didn't understand how this power could eat his son right from the inside out, taking his life. The pontiff asked that the men remember the oracle who spoke in prophecy when Lebanon was born. It said that the sun was chilling you, and it would no longer carry the bright light it once did. A girl was to be born in the near future, and her birth was very important, for she would be his light, and the only way to save the sun is to find and embrace that light. Another person who was blessed and displayed an incredible amount of divine power was Duke Balsalon's daughter, namely Regina. The pontiff asked if they could tell the family about this oracle, and asked for their help. But the Car, sighing heavily, said that as far as he knew, the Balsalons were the most important in the nobility, and if rumors about it were to spread, the prestige they had left would simply fall. And that will be enough to give us a reason to seize power. Sighing heavily, the man replied that Levan must know that because he was stubbornly opposed to sending gifts to Duke's daughter. And when he becomes an obstacle to the imperial family, he will simply end his life in order for things to fall into place. The pontiff, with his head down, turned to His Highness and said that if he could only find his lost daughter, then they would definitely be able to cure His Highness. He was quite sure that the girl, his wife after all, even his daughter, was gifted with prophetic powers. At this very time, Levan sat smoking his cigarette as usual to keep himself alive, and Giselle stood beside him, for he might need something. They were silent for a while, and then he inquired about that bouquet. He asked the girl if freesias were not in the answer, how she was going to be responsible. Giselle then replied that if he wanted to throw her in jail, she wouldn't resist and would stay locked up. She also said that whatever he wanted, she would fulfill, for as long as she could. Levan wondered in surprise as he began to put out his cigarette. Does she really think he wants and enjoys getting rid of the maid? But in his opinion, it's too boring. Giselle was a little surprised. She knew freesias were the right answer in the future, and she really wished he hadn't told her to just cook something. Then the girl knelt down and, addressing His Majesty, said that she had gone beyond the bounds of what was permissible. When the man heard this, he looked at her in surprise and asked her what she was even saying. But Giselle, without raising her head, replied that she dared to interfere in His Highness's affairs. Yes, and besides, to assert herself at that expense, she had expressed her opinion when she was a mere maid. So she asked that he forgive her for that. Lebanon stood up from his seat and walked closer to the maid, lifting her head to look at him, and said that he was really impressed, all because Frisias were a bad choice. However, Vitya, as she shook so much with fear, he realized he had managed to catch her in a lie to him. Giselle immediately became very tense, for she did not know what might happen next, but she answered nothing. Levan then, turning away from her, said he had a schedule, so she'd better hurry up and get his bathroom ready finally. Panfik passed by some dungeon in the evening and went lower and lower. When he was already at the very bottom, he couldn't figure out what that scent was when he opened the doors. But as he looked to the side, he saw the gentleman standing. Levan, smiling, turned to him and said that he hoped he had enjoyed his stay with them. The man immediately bowed and said he was pleased to welcome the little son of the world. Lebanon, passing by, asked for his help again and told him that he had been waiting for it already. Panfik immediately replied that certainly he could share his divine power with him, and at that moment, they held out their hands to each other, thus transmitting the divine power of Lebanon. Everything around them was very bright, and it was a pleasant sensation for the man. Their guest himself, when he sniffed the unfamiliar odor more closely, he noticed that it was the unusual odor of his daily cigars. So, looking directly at the man, he inquired, "Has anything around him changed recently?" Lebanon, smiling, replied that he did not think there had been any great change. The man immediately, of course, didn't believe him, but said that since that was the case, he would still give him some more divine power to make it better. Levan immediately thanked him, and the pontiff replied that he should be fine with that for a while, just lighting some incense. And so, while the man was out of the room, Giselle was just about to light some incense to cleanse his room before bedtime. At times like this, she remembered her mother's words about how if she left the estate, she would simply die. Certainly she has not been kicked out of the palace yet. However, she didn't know when that might even happen. The girl was simply crushed and didn't know what to do now. She really wished she had her mother by her side to help her. Giselle remembered how once as a child her mother had immediately comforted her after nightmares and hugged her very gently. Those had been the sweetest moments. She always hummed some lullaby and soothing music to her in order that Giselle would no longer be afraid. She began to soothe herself with the thoughts that Frisias really weren't a bad choice. It was the right thing to do. So everything was bound to be all right. So she set off, humming the tune her mother always sang to her, and thought that she had managed to overcome the first obstacle in her path. At this time, Lebanon was standing behind the wall and saw the girl pass. He heard the music and was a little interested, but when the footsteps died down, he went back to his room. The man sat on the couch and thought about various things. He was interested in the servant's question, who asked him what had changed recently. He had numerous maids coming and going all the time. However, this girl was rather quiet and unique, unlike all the others. He unbuttoned his shirt and, leaning against the back of the couch, also began strumming some kind of tune. Lewan noticed from her speech that she was quite a pleasant and very intelligent girl, and also her aura didn't look like a normal maid. At that moment he realized that something had really changed, and he could see it. He could not, however, say exactly what had changed and what it was. The next morning Giselle was sitting with the rest of the maids drinking her morning coffee, when suddenly she heard some of them talking, asking in surprise, "Does the man really call her Petals?" The maids laughed, not realizing what kind of name that even was, but another girl replied that it was the maid in charge of His Majesty's bedroom. She had also heard that the man had given her that particular nickname. They laughed for a long time about this funny nickname and couldn't stop themselves from making up jokes. And Giselle was very surprised, all because the man had summoned her quite early, and even during her working hours. She didn't understand why he suddenly wanted to see her, but she set off, for she could not be late, and assumed she had done something wrong, such as tidying up the bedclothes, or perhaps she had lit his incense improperly. As soon as she got upstairs, she immediately opened the door and turned to His Highness, inquiring if he wanted to see her. As soon as Giselle opened the door, a rather strange and pungent scent was immediately poured over her. It was the incense she always lit in the Crown Prince's bedroom, but this time it was different. She felt her head begin to spin violently, and her legs began to feel stiff along with her whole body. She couldn't even stay on her feet and fell to the floor. She didn't understand why he always lit that awful stinky incense. But Levan stepped closer to her, wondering how long she planned to stay near the door. He pulled back a chair and told her to come in and sit down. When Giselle saw this, she was very surprised, but she couldn't believe that His Highness had personally supported a chair for her and invited her to sit beside him. Soon afterward, he sat down across from her and, holding out some papers, said that she had given some pretty good advice about the bouquet last time. He gave her the papers and told her he was using them to send various invitations. So he asked her to pick one that she thought would look good. The girl didn't like what was going on, because she was going to stay as far away from him as possible, not on her own time. So she decided to pick up the paper as soon as possible and get out of there. She pondered for a while, and then suddenly Levan turned to her, telling her that she had a rather unique hair color and wondering who she thought he was in general. The girl was immediately distracted from her work and looked at him in surprise and said that she wasn't sure, but in fact she was well aware that it was all about her unusual color. That's why the Crown Prince is interested in a simple maid like her. Then she replied that she had never heard anything about her father, and her mother had just disappeared. And of course, she didn't remember it very well because it happened back when she was a baby, so she doesn't know where she got her hair color from. Levan stared at her for a while, and afterward inquired what she had been doing before she was summoned to him. Giselle was even a little confused when she heard that. She apologized and said that she had just had dinner. When the man heard this, he laughed out loud and said that was why she looked so excited when she first came to him. Giselle, hearing this, became very indignant and asked him what he meant, but Levan said nothing. He took the papers from her and replied that he had to interrupt her meal and added that he would send her dinner to her room after their meeting. When he moved closer to her, the girl even felt herself begin to feel uncomfortable and didn't understand how this had even happened. A few hours later, evening came, but Levan was still sitting in his office sorting out some paperwork. When an aide came down to him, he said that he should take at least a little break from his work, for he was simply ruining his health in this way. But the man, without even taking his eyes off his work, said that there were still a great many things left to do that he had to attend to, so he would make the most of it as best he could until he began to roll off his feet. Varn picked up another stack of papers that the gentleman had already reviewed and thought about what the man was saying that was excruciating, as if he had been stabbed with hundreds of needles. It would even be painful for any other person to walk under this circumstance. However, His Highness does all the work even in this state of health. After a while, the man asked what he thought about finally meeting Lady Regina already. The aide said she was incredibly happy with last night's bouquet, and things could definitely be different this time. So he asked if the gentleman wanted to send her some mail. Lebanon, hearing this, immediately looked at him angrily and asked him to stop. The man agreed that he had been contentedly close to their family during his childhood. However, they were the first to destroy their good relationship. For the past 6 months, he had sent her letters, gifts, and even summoned her to visit him. But Regina never responded to any of this and ignored him the whole time, so he wanted to end even that conversation. They were silent for a while, and then suddenly, Leban noticed some strange papers in his possession and immediately inquired what they meant. The aide said it was the report on the kept girl, the information His Highness wanted so badly about this girl. Afterward, Varn said that she went to the palace with her mother when she was only a newborn. She had been living in the Moonlight Palace as a maid all this time until she moved to the Sun Palace on the recommendation of a maid from her previous place of employment. Then the gentleman, going through the papers, inquired if they had found absolutely nothing about her mother. The man, upon reflection, said that they assumed the woman was also one of the maids who had died that day 15 years ago. When Levan heard this, he was immediately alert, for on this very day exactly 15 years ago, his mother, Empress Rodmira, had been brutally murdered, and the man who killed his mother was an imperial knight who everyone thought would never betray her. He killed absolutely every servant girl that was in his way, and then just disappeared with the help of the Basilian family who reached out to him, which means that the girl also lost her mother on the same day to just one person. And so, while the man was remembering all this, he suddenly saw some strange man in front of him. He had short hair and wondered why he was crying. Levan immediately assumed it was some long-ago memory of his that he had completely forgotten about, but his head ached even more at that moment. Then an aide approached him saying that perhaps the girl was too young. However, apparently she had absolutely no memory of her mother's death. The gentleman then asked, was she really 19 years old at that time? And not a single person had even bothered to tell her what had happened to her own mother? Lewan couldn't believe that it was really true, for it was rather cruel to the girl. But the aide replied that he had learned that no one had even tried to get close to her, except that maid because of the moonlight. When the man heard this, he was very sad, because she had no friends or family. She was a maid with an incredibly unique hair color. After a little silence, Varna said that was all the information they had managed to get, and the Lord replied that in that case they could look for nothing more. Giselle had long since gone to bed, but she was suddenly awakened by the maids, who came in the middle of the night to invite her to a party at such a late hour. The girl was very surprised, and wondered who was throwing such parties, and the maid explained that a night like this was the perfect time for everyone to meet the new girl together. Another maid smiled wickedly and wondered if she didn't want to come. She also added that it wouldn't take long at all, and another maid who was standing behind everyone inquired if the girl liked the food His Highness had sent her. Giselle stood there hesitating, wondering what she should do. She realized that if she didn't sleep now, the next day would be ruined, but she also felt that if she refused their offer, she would definitely not be able to survive among all these employees as a maid. So the girl agreed to their proposal after all. Then the maid told her to put out her light and follow them. And so, a few days passed since that night. One evening, when Giselle had prepared the gentleman's bath and he had already taken it, she asked him for forgiveness. Levan, wiping his hair, which was wet, looked at her in surprise and noticed that she looked pretty awful, and that was indeed true. The girl looked very unkempt, and her hair was disheveled, as well as the greatest bruises under her eyes that spoke of her lack of sleep. He also thought about how she looked more like a withered petal of some flower, but he didn't question her about what had happened. Soon afterward, he went to his office to sort out some paperwork, while Giselle stood nearby, clearing his ashtray. When he saw that she was straight up falling asleep on the go, he said with a heavy sigh that if she was done, she could leave. Giselle immediately bowed and started out the door, and the man told himself that she shouldn't bother him. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong with her. Certainly he had absolutely no time to make any sort of showdown, for he must do as much as he can, work as hard as he can while he feels good. So the man tried to push the various thoughts of the maid away from him and go back to looking at the papers. But then suddenly his hand began to shake violently, and because of this, he put a blot on some rather important documents. Lebanon realized that this was a very bad sign, so he opened the drawer and pulled out his medicinal cigar from there. He was about to smoke it when suddenly he heard a strange shout from down the hall. It belonged to a girl, and it came from an open window that was not far from his desk. So the man immediately got up and walked over to see what was going on. It was already deep night, so it was hard to see anything. However, he could see some white silhouettes walking below, and a girl screaming for them to leave her. That welcome party to which the maids called Giselle the first night began with the washing of all the maids' blankets, and the girl consoled herself with the thought that it was quite normal. She would be able to take a little nap on her break, so she would be able to stay there a little longer than she had hoped. However, they didn't give her a single moment of rest. Ever since she had come to their so-called party, they had taken all the work on her, including even cleaning the rooms, halls, and more. As she stood by Lebanon, she thought about the fact that she needed to pull herself together, because she certainly couldn't fall asleep right there in his office. And it had gone on like this for 4 days straight. After Giselle finished her work and went to her lodgings, she was immediately greeted by the very hooligans and asked if she remembered to wash many more blankets for them before the next day. They kept laughing and talking about how they were tired of sleeping without covers, because the nights were already getting cold sometimes. As a result, the girl's relationship with the maids was even worse than before. However, she preferred to just treat them indifferently. There was no telling what might happen if she reacted in the wrong way. Things could get even worse, but she'd been thinking like that for a long time. And one day, Giselle realized she wasn't going to put up with it anymore, so she turned them down, thinking that she didn't want them bullying her anymore and adding extra work. The girl asked why she even had to wash their work blankets, and added that they were treating her in a way that even violated all the rules. When the maids heard this, they immediately began to laugh loudly, and one of them said that, come to think of it, she was very close friends with the maid from the Moon Palace, and wondered if Giselle was going to complain to them. Giselle stepped closer to them and said that she wasn't crazy after all, so she wouldn't tell the woman, because if she found out, it would be completely different than they could even imagine. She ran up to her main offender and grabbed her by the hair and began to lower her to the ground, while yelling that this would all just end in disciplinary action, and nothing much would happen. The maid tried to get out of her arms and kept screaming for her to let her go. When she saw her co-workers, she wondered why they weren't helping her finish this, but the girls just continued to stand there and watch. Giselle was then finally dragged away, and she said that they had all asked for it. So if they make someone work for them, they should at least give them time to get some sleep. Lebanon, whose windows overlooked this whole theatrical scene in progress, watched it all in complete silence. But when he looked closer, he saw the familiar bright purple hair and immediately recognized it as his petal. They fought for a while longer, and then the man decided to intervene in their squabble. He began to reprimand them while the girls stood with disheveled hair and some even in torn uniforms. As they passed by the maids, they talked about how he was really right. After all, he was the little son of their empire, so they shouldn't have done that. Then he glimpsed Giselle and said that he could see that somehow they had dared to behave so foolishly and insolently right in front of his palace. One of the maids suddenly fell on her knees and began to bow to His Excellency, saying that it was all a grievous sin. So they begged him to forgive them, for they repented and would never do such a thing again. When he heard this, he immediately raised her head to look at him and asked if she was really calling it a sin. But then his voice suddenly became very rough, and he asked if they were even willing to pay for all their sins they had committed. When the maid heard this, she was very frightened and was even ready to cry if she hadn't been so frightened. Giselle, who was standing at the very back, thought about the fact that she would be kicked out eventually after all, even though it had been quite a while. Soon, when the turn came to scold her, she closed her eyes in anticipation that he might even beat her. But His Highness only put his hand on her head and wondered if she really believed she could break anything if she attacked them with her little physical training. And when Giselle heard this, she was truly stunned. She looked at the gentleman at once, and the latter, running his hand through her hair, said that he must have been mistaken in his judgment after all. He called her petal again and said that apparently she was a lot crazier than he'd ever thought. Soon, when it was finally over and the maids were dismissed to their rooms, the man returned to his office and called Marianne to him. He turned to the maid and asked her to tell him everything about what had happened in the first place. The head maid, bowing, replied that apparently one of the maids was going to give Giselle a welcome party. The man, upon hearing this, was very surprised and asked if she could really call it a party, and added that he would have called such an admission pretty aggressive in general. Because he felt sick again, he lit another cigar, which he had not managed then, and looking at Marianne, added that he had already instructed everyone what they should do as a sign of punishment. When Marianne heard this, she looked at the gentleman and asked if he had done it personally. Lebanon replied that, of course, and also added that he thought they could close the matter and not discuss it any further. The maid, of course, agreed to this, and thought that she would scold those maids for what had happened. When the man was alone, he began to remember Giselle looking at him with frightened eyes. She looked as if she was asking him why he wasn't punishing her with the others. In fact, there was certainly a lot to punish her for. However, when he thought about the whole situation, he realized that he didn't even want to do it. Lewan didn't know what it was all about, but assumed it was probably because he'd learned about her lonely palace life, or because he'd learned that her life 15 years ago had been ruined, just like his. He continued to smoke and leaned back in his chair, figuring that all would end well, for he had assigned an appropriate punishment to the maid who had abused her. So he felt that at that moment he could finally stop worrying about her, for he even saw that she could take care of herself. When Giselle woke up the next morning, she couldn't immediately recognize where she was. When she looked around, she realized she was in her bedroom. She realized that it was really true that she was back, and she fell asleep immediately, so she only had time to change her clothes. The girl also recalled the night that one of the guards named Izar Ortelot had ordered that the girl who had bullied Giselle be sent to the basement prison. The head of the imperial order had personally dealt with the matter in a small dispute among the maids, and it had surprised Giselle greatly at the time. The man that night said that His Highness had ordered him to give them some food for a week. He then turned to the girl with purple hair, and he said that the master had asked him to tell her that she was not guilty and that no one could touch her in any way. After that, another guard came up to her and asked her to let him walk her to her room. Giselle was then very surprised, but also incredibly tired, so she didn't argue and just went to her place to finally get some well-deserved rest. And then in the morning when she woke up, she thought about the fact that he had clearly said that it was His Highness's order. So she couldn't believe that the Crown Prince had actually intervened in their dispute and helped her. He had even assigned an imperial order to her for a person like her, which meant that no one could touch her anymore, because otherwise, a very bad outcome awaited them. But the girl had only one question. She did not understand why he had done it. But suddenly a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She had no time even to say anything when suddenly Madame Marianne replied that she was coming in. She took a chair and sat down opposite the girl and told her what had happened. Giselle heard this and wondered what she meant by it. But the woman explained that all the girls who had been imprisoned in the prison had become demoted in rank, so that now she was becoming higher than all of them, and thus held the rank of head maid. When she heard this, she was very surprised and stammered and replied that as far as she knew, only maids who had passed the coming-of-age ceremony were allowed to become head maids. And besides, it had been less than a week since she had entered the Sun Palace, which was too short a time for such a position. However, Marianne, who was the governess and had charge of all the maids, replied that His Highness had ordered it, which meant that they could not disobey. They were silent for a while, and then the woman said that rumors had spread around the estate that he had appointed her as his favorite. So the woman asked that Giselle make sure she was behaving properly and correctly. After all, she was now the head maid, so she would have to be even more sensible in order to fulfill everything that needed to be done. When evening came, Giselle immediately went to his room to prepare it for the night as usual. The girl was still thinking about what had happened and realized that in this palace, the only person she must avoid in order to stay alive was the Crown Prince of Lebanon. She had always endeavored to hide her hair and lower her head, after which she did her work quietly, and then holding her breath went away, for the incense only made her worse. That was exactly what she was going to do. But at that moment she suddenly heard some strange sound, so she immediately turned around to see what was there. When she looked more closely, she saw that the sounds were coming from the bed where the master was lying. It was a painful moan, and she didn't know what to do now. She wasn't sure if she should go over and check if everything was okay. Giselle began to approach the bed with small steps, then thought about the fact that she could get in huge trouble for disturbing His Majesty if she intervened, and it turned out to be nothing serious. But she also thought about the fact that he might be very sick and unwell. So she opened the curtain as she got closer, and when she saw the man who was lying in sweat and turning from side to side, she cried out to him. She was very worried, for he looked quite unwell. The girl just stood there for a while. She was about to go over and do something, but when she saw that halfway through his robe was undone, she was even kind of uncomfortable, which is why she just closed the curtain back up and left without doing anything. The next morning, when the gentleman woke up and was feeling better, he was sitting at his desk and also receiving guests. It was Duke Rovian's second son, and his name was Louis. And he told the lad that he had heard of a knight from the Starin region being spoken of in the city. He, smiling, also told his brother that he had also heard that this guy was also planning to participate in the competition that was about to take place. The head of the imperial order, Izar Taylot, was also present with them, and he simply stood aside and remained silent. Then Varen's assistant spoke up and turned to Isaac and said that he would still win, because the fact that his opponent was still very young would definitely not do him any good in front of a classy warrior like Izar. Louis looked at him angrily and said that he had told them that it was really quite serious this time. Hadn't he? Crown Prince Aaron's bodyguard, Aaron, was also in the room, and he said it was all very good. However, until last year, the only leaders were Izar and Aaron's father. Louis immediately said that this was all perfectly true, for it was time for a new champion to be born. He then turned to His Highness and asked if he agreed. Levan, who was still sorting through the papers and glimpsing their conversation, replied that it did make sense and wasn't so idiotic. Then an assistant came up to him and handed him some papers. He also said that he could get a cigarette for him to smoke, to which the man replied that he would not be doing that now, but he now said that it had been quite some time since he had been treated by the pontiff, and without cigarettes it would be very difficult for him to exist, much less to do his work. Lebanon suddenly thought about it and noticed that everything was strange. The pain was not so frequent and great. He could not understand what had happened. But then suddenly he began to see a memory in front of him. Like one night he was lying there. He was very sick, and the maid came. He grabbed Giselle's hand at that moment and immediately saw her face clearly in front of him. But it was really only a memory. Meanwhile, in the back of the palace, a rather serious conversation was going on. Viscount Belton had suddenly summoned Giselle to him for a talk. He smiled and inquired if she was correct in realizing that she was a maid by rank. It was not a very pleasant thing for the girl to say, but she said it was perfectly correct. Then he, coming even closer to her, said that she was quite reliable and beautiful, and he understood why the Crown Prince had chosen her as his favorite after all. In fact, Viscount Belton was one of the palace officials and was behaving very inappropriately. She had seen Viscount Belton in her dreams of the future, and he was on Regina's side, basically like most aristocrats. The man asked the maid if it was true that she was the Crown Prince's woman. Giselle felt very uncomfortable with this talk, and putting her hands together to make them less shaky, she wondered how she could become His Highness's wife. After all, she was only an ordinary maid. The man suddenly became angry and wondered if she thought he had summoned her just to make jokes. Giselle then said that she was well aware of the rumors but didn't understand why he was so interested. She explained that those maids whom His Majesty had punished had done the girl great harm, and she believed that was why the rumors had begun to spread. But the Viscount suddenly, laughing, said that he would call it better, as a man knows how to curry favor well with someone, and wondered if he had ever been interested in a maid for nothing more than a mere pleasure. He kept laughing hysterically and said it all looked like the cold prince who was a wolf just gave up after all this. He said it was all quite funny, because he tried to work hard, but ended up falling in love with a very humble maid who didn't even have anything behind her. After that, he suddenly came closer to the girl and grabbed her face and pulled her to him. He said he wanted Giselle to find out what the Crown Prince was really hiding and to tell him about it later. He smilingly also said that if she helped, he just might even make her an honorable woman if the information really turned out to be good. But the girl answered him nothing. Alyosha averted her gaze, trying to get away. He grabbed her even harder and, still shouting, asked how she dared to avoid his gaze. He called her a mere maid and doesn't understand how she even dares to do such a thing, for she should be thanking him for such opportunities. The man let her go and told her to go ahead and keep doing her job for her little brain to live on. As he left, he also asked that Giselle learn what the best way to stay alive in this palace was. The girl sat down on the ground and was very upset. She just didn't know what she was going to do now. She was lost. Giselle thought about Regina, whom she had seen in her dreams. The same, in turn, was already an empress. However, the man who was next with her was certainly not Lebanon. There was a rebellion of the aristocrats, and eventually the death of the Crown Prince, and the girl didn't know if she was choosing a future power that would have time to rise up and gain all the power and strength, or was it better for her to remain loyal and be faithful to the Crown Prince until death overtook him? By then, she could already find the answer to that troubling question. Lebanon went outside one evening to get some fresh air, because surprisingly, he was feeling pretty good. A man was passing by his garden, in which many red roses grew, and he plucked one and looked at it closely. The master could not understand why his pains had suddenly subsided, and the maid was not giving him any peace of mind. He didn't know if there was any connection between all these events, but even if there was, he had to find out by all means. But even if it doesn't really exist, he can find out for himself what the reason for this is. Shortly afterward, when he returned back to the manor, he began to put on his nightgown. A maid came in and, bowing, said hello to the man. Turning to her, he turned and inquired, "Why has she come?" After all, Maid Giselle is supposed to watch over his bedroom until dawn. The maid tried to explain everything to him in a trembling voice. She immediately recounted to him the conversation with which the older maid had come to her. Giselle then said with a smile on her face that she would like to trade jobs with her. When the maid heard this, she was very surprised and said that she was not yet able to serve His Highness and be so close to him. "But it's already taken," she replied, "which is all right, for the job is actually quite a bit easier than she thinks." She then asked her for a mop and told her that it was her turn to clean the corridors. When the maid had finished telling the master this story, he was thinking. The girl was just standing in the corridors and dusting the windowsills, where flowers used to stand. However, they had been removed for some reason. How then suddenly behind her but heard the familiar voice of Lebanon, who seeing her at once came nearer and addressed her. But Giselle, when she heard him, ran away at once. He didn't even catch up with her but saw her go into a room, so he followed her footsteps. As soon as he entered the room, he immediately saw the other maid and inquired where Maid Giselle was. The maid immediately panicked and said that she had been there recently, but when she turned around, she saw that she was gone. The man shouted after her for a while, but it was no use. Giselle didn't even turn around. The next day, as usual, Lebanon was sitting in his office doing his work. An assistant came to him and told him that usually such people hide when they have done something wrong. He even raised his voice, saying that it was pretty smart of her to think about not hurting him, so he asked that the Lord be careful. But the man was very surprised when he heard this, and he doubted the aide's words that this maid could really harm him in any way. Lebanon couldn't believe that she was intent on avoiding him and hiding all the time. He didn't understand how she dared to be so insolent to him. However, it doesn't really matter how often she avoids him. After all, she is still in the Sun Palace, which means they will run into each other sooner or later. He was even curious to see how long all this nonsensical behavior would continue. He assumed it was likely to be an amazing sight, and so he decided to play by her rules. At this very time, Lebanon's father was sitting in the dining room drinking his afternoon tea. The man thought about the fact that after his older brother, who was the previous emperor, passed away after falling off his horse, he was forced to ascend the throne in place of his 3-year-old nephew. The man simply had no choice. However, this rank of the son, the highest position in the empire, he had never desired. All this power was absolutely disliked by the man, and the responsibility that came with it. From the very day he ascended the throne, the sheer hell began. He was vilified by people who suspected him of being involved with his brother, and in that terrible accident that killed his wife at the hands of a knight loyal to the previous emperor. To make matters worse, his own son, Levan, was born with a sinister oracle and grew more distressed by the day. Ever since Lebanon's mother died, the boy had never smiled once. One day, however, he approached his father with a mysterious request. He told his father that he would like to ask the pontiff to come and visit them. When the man first heard this, he was very surprised. He even asked if the boy was so sick that he needed help. The guy replied that he was fine and his father shouldn't worry. He just wants the pontiff to come to check something. He also said that it could help alleviate his greatest pains. When the man heard this, he said that if it was true, he would send a message asking him to visit the palace as soon as possible. Levan immediately smiled and thanked his father for his generosity, saying it was very nice of him. The man smiled and said he was glad to hear some good news. He noticed that the boy looked pleased and decided that something good was finally happening. Lebanon also smiled and agreed that he had noticed something funny lately. Last night, Lebanon finally confronted the girl and asked her what excuse she had come up with for the situation. He also assumed that there must be a good reason why she had so persistently avoided him, being a mere maid. Giselle, without turning to meet his gaze, said that she thought the ridiculous rumors of her selection as his favorite might affect his credibility. Levan asked with a smile what kind of rumors they were talking about. The girl replied that they were rumors that he had chosen her as his favorite. Levan walked over to the bed and sat on it, noting that his authority probably looked undignified in the eyes of the maid if she chose to hide because of the rumors. Giselle tried to explain that she didn't mean that, but was interrupted by strange sounds coming from Lebanon's mouth. He suddenly grabbed his head in intense pain and asked Giselle to give him a hand. Giselle looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant, but he ordered her in a gruff voice to make it quick. The girl still didn't understand anything, but when she approached him, she put her hand in his, and he reached for her fingers, wrapping them around his. Giselle looked at him in surprise and asked what was even going on. for she didn't understand what he was doing all this for. In that moment, Lebanon felt the same sensations he had felt that night when she took his hand. These feelings were like little thorns that stuck in his body and began to slowly melt away. A tremendous refreshing energy was rising up his arm, cleansing and illuminating his gaze. They just held hands in silence for a while, and then he let her go, telling her that everything was okay now. He wondered if there was some unknown but rather powerful force in this maid named Giselle. When he looked at her, he said she could go now. The next day, Giselle went early in the morning to wipe the windows clean of dirt, and was still thinking about the previous evening. She remembered the look on the gentleman's face the evening before. He was looking at her as if he recognized something, but she couldn't describe exactly what it was. She was reminded of the words of a maid who spoke of rumors that he had chosen her to be his favorite, but Giselle quickly dismissed those thoughts, deciding that it was simply impossible and illogical. Giselle also thought about the fact that the Crown Prince she had met for the first time would never exactly do that. A maid began to walk past her, and the girl said hello to her in a sad voice. But when the maid came closer, held out some paper in her hand and left, Giselle was very surprised. She didn't understand who the note could be from, and most importantly, what it was for. Then she remembered an unpleasant encounter in the garden with Viscount Belton, who had spoken of her going to the third pillar beyond the garden. She started to walk away and thought, who knows, the nobles would soon come to power and kill the Crown Prince. And so, at this time in the Imperial Palace, namely in the garden, the girl came to the Viscount. Before she made her final decision, she wanted to know for sure if she would stay alive in the palace for as long as possible. And to do so, she had aloofly avoided the Crown Prince and deliberately ignored the Viscount's errand. But when she confronted him now, he simply slapped her on the cheek without explaining why. The man started rubbing his palm and turned to Giselle and said that he thought she was smart. But apparently she was so stupid that she didn't even realize the advantageousness of the situation. The girl continued to sit on her knees and said that she wasn't lying at all. His Highness really didn't have any secrets, and so there was nothing she could tell him that he wanted to hear. The Viscount was silent for a while, and then wondered how she was going to explain it at all, and took out a small stone, showing it to the girl. When Giselle took a closer look, she realized that it was an incense that could not be taken out of the prince's room, and only the maid knew about it, no one else. The man squeezed that little rock in his hand and told her with all the hatred in the world not to try to be clever and tell him the truth. Did she really think he enjoyed wasting time making jokes about her? The girl immediately said that she really didn't know anything. She had heard that this incense was meant to calm His Highness's body and mind, for he worked hard and could not pass out so easily. But the Viscount, stepping aside, said it was all very foolish, and she was now risking her future in a sandcastle that would soon collapse. He also added that she still believes that the Crown Prince will protect her, but it is a foolish hope that is not grounded in anything. At that moment, the girl turned her head and noticed the Viscount brutally stepping on the flowers that had burst through the tiles. She thought of the delicate midnight flowers barely living in such crevices, but powerful forces were coming at them, which meant she could get through too. Giselle moved closer to him and asked that he tell her how she could stay alive, and what she needed to do to get his attention. In fact, the only thing the girl could do was pretend to be harmless and unaware, like a midnight flower that just grows. The Viscount moved closer to her and put his hand to her cheek, and Giselle said that people talk all the time about the Crown Prince making her a favorite. However, he tells her absolutely nothing about his secrets, so she assumes that he probably thinks she is not a person to be trusted. The girl decides that the role of a maid who is loved but not trusted important information will suit her well. He was silent for a while, and then, smiling, he said that she probably felt bad about being treated like that, but she still needed to learn the prince's weaknesses. He, smiling, also said that if she could really do it, he would give her protection. He promised that he would really do it, and also advised her to use her beautiful and cute face as a way to draw out information. After that, he turned around and left, and Giselle, who continued to sit on the floor, thought about the fact that for the nobles, a maid is like a fruit fly. It can be squashed and just thrown away, then it's pipes. She's like a creature to the Viscount who can't stand up for herself once, even if it's all unfair and horrible. She is like that little bug that everyone forgets after death. Giselle couldn't contain her emotions and immediately cried. The girl agreed with herself that if she really thought about it, she realized that this whole situation started from the moment she first started working for the Crown Prince. Then she finally got back on her feet and decided that it didn't matter at all how hard she worked, or how many times she tried. She still doesn't know if she can escape from the Crown Prince, in order to survive and not get maimed. Giselle just stood in the gazebo for a while longer, and after that she was about to head back to the palace. But she didn't notice that there was a man watching the whole situation through a window not far from her. It turned out to be Isaac, and when the man returned to the manor in the evening, he went straight to the Crown Prince and told him all about it. Lebanon did not believe him the first time, and asked if he was sure of the information. The man replied that he had seen it with his own eyes and could not, of course, hear the details. However, he clearly saw what was happening there. Isaac also said that he couldn't approach her easily, because it seemed like he had to stay the opposite way away, because she would start making things up and lying again. He was silent for some time, and then, turning to His Highness, inquired if he would like to ask a few questions of this maid Giselle. Lebanon looked at him sternly and asked him what he himself thought the most important thing would be for a man hanging over a precipice on a cliff. The warrior bowed and replied that of course help would be needed. The man took off his work glasses and replied that it was quite true, and it is he who will give the poor girl a helping hand, in order for her to get out of that cliff edge and finally be able to live a normal life. In the evening, as usual, Giselle came into the room to light incense. The man was already in bed, and when he heard her blowing out the match, he turned to her at once. He turned to her again, smiling, calling her Petals, and said he hadn't seen her in a while. Giselle was a little surprised to see him and jumped because of her fright, but she bowed and said hello to him. He smiled and said he was glad to welcome her back as his personal maid. He was in a rostrated robe and said she hadn't even tried to run away that day. Giselle covered the special incense jar and said she was just doing her job. Lebanon kept smiling and said she was definitely responsible and doing a good job. The girl thought about the fact that he certainly didn't know anything about her situation and was now smiling like that, as if it was all very funny, but there was absolutely no laughing matter. After this conversation, the girl went to the door and said goodnight to him. It was getting rather late, but Lebanon turned to the other side and wondered if she was trying to tell him so politely to shut up.